Before we start into our physics topics in earnest, there's a little bit more review of math that we need to do first. This new unit is on vectors, and we're going to find out that vectors are something that have not only an amount, a magnitude, but also a direction, and so we represent them using arrows. Now, because they have direction, what we're going to end up doing when we add vectors is actually add them as triangles. So we might have two vectors, and we want to find out how long a third vector is that is technically considered the addition of the two vectors. So this is kind of where we're headed, but before we get there, we're going to review some things about trigonometry, which is, again, the math of triangles. So this lesson is a review of trigonometry, should be review of the topic that you did in math last year. So, for example, this one actually should come all the way back from grade 8. Find the length of the missing side of the triangle. So in order to do this, in order to find a missing side, we always use a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Remember, this is your Pythagorean theorem. So if you have a generic right triangle, and it's important that it's a right triangle, we give names to the sides of variables to the sides. The two short sides are a and b, and you can swap those interchangeably, doesn't matter. But the longest side, your hypotenuse, is always going to be c. So in order to find the length of a missing side, we can use this a squared plus b squared equals c squared to figure out what's missing. So in the case of this triangle, if I'm comparing the two, I'm missing my side b. So I need to figure out how long b is. I've got the longest side here, the hypotenuse C is 73, and then the other short side A is 55. So I'm going to use a squared plus b squared equals c squared, plug in my value for A, 55 squared, plug in the value for B, we don't have, and plug in the value of C, 73 squared. Every single thing has to be squared. Go ahead and pull out your calculator so that you can type some of these things in. I don't think any of you is going to be doing these in your head. So I've got my calculator here, and I'm going to go 55 squared, 30, 25, b squared, I don't know, and 73 squared is 5329. To solve for b, I'm going to subtract from the left-hand side the 3025 to get the b squared by itself. So I've got b squared equals 5329 minus 3025. That's b squared is 2304. And then to find just b, I'm going to square root. So on my calculator, that's the shift squared button. You may need to find where that is on your calculator, 2304. And it tells me then b, so if I square root both sides, b itself is 48. Looking back at my question, 73 centimeters, 55 centimeters, this is going to be 48 centimeters as my final answer for the missing side. So if you're finding one of the short sides, it's going to require a little bit more work, a little bit more subtraction. If you're finding your hypotenuse, it actually is a little bit quicker. So example number 2, find the missing side. This time my triangle is turned around, but I can still identify that the longest side is going to be C, and this side can be A or B, doesn't matter. I'm going to call it B in this case just because, and call this A just to change things up a little bit. So again, I'm going to use a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I'm going to say this time I don't have a, so I'm going to leave that as an a squared. I have b as 7.6 squared and c as 19.3 squared. Now I'm going to save myself a few steps by moving this over and typing it all into my calculator at once. So I'm going to subtract from both sides 7.6 squared. And I actually can't simplify this yet. I'm just trying to get it so that I can type something into my calculator all at once. So this is 19.3 squared minus 7.6 squared. I can't combine them. They are exponents with different bases. Think of this as like x and y. But I can type that all into my calculator at once now. 19.3 squared minus 7.6 squared. That tells me a squared is 3.1473. So to get a, I'm going to square root both sides. So I'm going to just do that on my calculator. So a is the square root of this answer, 314.73. 17.74. I'm going to round to 3 sig figs. You can round always to 2 or 3 sig figs. So in this case, it's going to be 17.7 centimeters would be 3 sig figs. And that's it. That would be my final answer. If you wanted 2 sig figs, it would be exactly 18. And that would also be an acceptable answer. So always round to 2 or 3 sig figs. Example number 3, I want to find both x and y. X is down here is the short side, and y is the hypotenuse of my big triangle. So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, first I'm just going to find x, and to do that, I'm actually going to ignore all this extra bit here and just focus in on the little triangle there. So that's what I'm focusing on. I'm not going to actually erase that, but that's kind of, here's my A, B, C. It's a right triangle that I'm looking at for this first one. So when I think, okay, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the hypotenuse of my small triangle is the 17. And I can just call this b equals 15. And this a is x. So what I end up with, if I'm looking for a squared plus b squared equals c squared, I'm actually going to move my b squared over at this point to get a by itself because I'm looking for a squared. So subtract b squared from both sides to get a squared equals c squared minus b squared. Then I'm going to plug in my numbers. So if you actually have this memorized, or you can skip right to this step, this can actually be pretty useful. That's fine with me if you want to skip right here. So a, actually I'm going to rewrite that now. A is actually called x in this question. B is called 15 and c is 17. So 17 squared minus 15 squared. And to get the actual x, I'm going to square root that. I'm going to do that in one whole step on my calculator, but be a little bit careful with that. So when I want to square root something that's being subtracted, I'm going to use my square root symbol right away, but I'm going to put parentheses around here. Because remember that this is like a grouping symbol, an understood grouping symbol, but my calculator doesn't always do that automatically. So I'm going to put in parentheses 17 squared minus 15 squared, close the parentheses, and that will get me my answer right away. So I've got, in this case, x equals 8. Now remember, all your answers need to be to 2 or 3 sig figs. 8 is only 1 sig fig, so in order to make it 2, I'm going to add a 0.0. Because the decimals in the number, zeros to the right, do count, and now I've got 8.0 is 2 sig figs. This would be my answer for x. Now to find the answer for y, which is the next part of the question. It's essentially like saying I'm ignoring that there was a line in here, and I've got this one big triangle. And I'm looking at this big triangle and thinking, okay, how big are each of my sides? Well, B, I can still leave as 15, that's fine. But now this other side, I got this piece here as being 12, but this piece here, well, I just found that x was equal to 8. So in order to get this whole long side to be A, I would have this whole long side to be 8 plus 12 is 20, all the way from there to there. So when I'm looking for y in this case of this triangle is going to be c, and I'm thinking, okay, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I've already got c by itself, so I don't want to do the subtraction this time. I'm just going to plug in my numbers for a and b right away. So a squared is 20 squared, b squared is 15 squared, that's equal to c squared, and I'm going to square root that to get me my answer straight off the bat. Again, put parentheses around your 20 squared plus 15 squared. At least on my calculator, that's essential, or I'm going to end in trouble. You could try it both ways on your calculator just to see how it goes and see if you get the same answer or not. So this gives me then 25 equals c. And 25, or actually I should have changed the c. The c actually should be a y. So y equals 25. 25 has 2 sig figs already, so I don't need to add a 0.0. I could add a 0.0 to give it 3, but 2 is perfectly acceptable. Okay, so that's a review of your Pythagorean theorem. That is the first thing that you need to remember how to do in order to add vectors that we're going to see later on. Okay, so a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That lets us find the missing side of a triangle, either a short side or the longest side, by using Pythagorean theorem.